My wife went out on a date with her rich boss after 15 years together. I ended the marriage that night. 15 years of marriage, and there I was, pacing my own living room like some deadbeat tenant who just got the eviction notice slipped under his door. You know that feeling when you're in your own house, but somehow you feel like you don't belong there anymore? Yeah, that was me on a Tuesday night, wearing my favorite ratty sweatpants and a t-shirt with a ketchup stain I'd given up trying to explain away. Real sexy, I know. The kind of outfit that screams, "I've given up," louder than a gym membership in February. The roast chicken I'd made. And let me tell you, I'd actually tried this time, followed a recipe and everything. None of that eyeball the seasoning garbage I usually pull, sat on the dining table like a monument to my stupidity. Golden brown skin, herbs I couldn't even pronounce scattered on top, the works. I'd even bought the fancy organic potatoes that cost more than my weekly coffee budget. The candles I'd set out, the ones that supposedly smelled like coastal sunset or some marketing nonsense, remained unlit in their little glass holders, mocking me with their potential for romance that would never materialize. The whole scene looked like a Pinterest board titled, "Sad Man Tries to Save Marriage with Poultry." My wife, Marissa, had walked out of our bedroom 3 hours earlier wearing a black dress that screamed romantic steakhouse with cloth napkins and waiters who introduced themselves like you're supposed to remember their names. The kind of place where they put the menu prices in tiny font because if you have to ask, you can't afford it. But no, according to her, she was heading to ladies' night at Chili's with the girls. I'd spent the last 2 hours doing what any rational person would do in my situation, losing my mind in slow motion. I checked my phone 47 times. Yes, I counted. I'm not proud of it, but accuracy matters when you're documenting your descent into paranoid husband territory. No text from Marissa. I'd even tried calling once, got sent straight to voicemail, and her cheerful recorded voice telling me to leave a message after the beep made me want to throw my phone through the TV. The chicken was getting colder by the minute, and honestly, it felt like a pretty accurate metaphor for our marriage. I'd put in all this effort, seasoned it, timed it perfectly, and for what? To watch it sit there and congeal while my wife was probably out there batting her eyelashes at someone who wouldn't know a home-cooked meal if it slapped him across his privileged face. Her boss, Victor freaking Langston. The name alone sounded like a villain from a soap opera. The kind of guy who probably has a leather chair in his office that costs more than my entire living room set and thinks summer home means a place you visit between your other homes. Billionaire real estate mogul. The type of dude who calls yachts boats like he's being humble and genuinely believes poor people only exist in history books or as cautionary tales he tells at country club brunches. I'd met him exactly twice. Once at Marissa's company Christmas party, where he'd shaken my hand with the grip of a man who's never done manual labor in his life, all soft palms and manicured nails. The second time was at some charity gala she'd dragged me to, and I'd watched him work the room like a politician, all teeth and charm and handshakes that probably closed million-dollar deals. Both times, I'd seen the way Marissa looked at him. Like he was fascinating. Like he was important. Like he was everything I wasn't. I'd seen the way she laughed at his jokes. And let me be clear, his jokes weren't funny. They were the kind of jokes rich people tell where the punchline is basically, "I have money and you don't. Isn't that hilarious?" He'd say something like, "The market's up today," and she'd giggle like he'd just performed a comedy special, throwing her head back and touching his arm in that way that makes every husband in the room want to spontaneously combust. I didn't want to be that guy. The jealous husband. The insecure one who can't handle his wife having a male boss. But come on. When your wife spends more time choosing her outfit for a business meeting than she ever did for your 15th anniversary last month, which, by the way, she'd shown up to in jeans and the first shirt she'd grabbed from her closet, you don't need to be Sherlock Holmes. You don't need a magnifying glass and a deerstalker hat. You just need eyeballs. Functional eyeballs and the ability to recognize when you're being played like a fiddle in an orchestra of lies. I walked over to the chicken, picked up the knife, and cut myself a piece. It was dry. Of course it was dry. I'd left it sitting out for 3 hours waiting for someone who wasn't coming home to eat it. I chewed mechanically, tasting nothing, and stared at the empty chair across from me where Marissa should have been sitting. Where she would have been sitting if I mattered. If we mattered. If any of this mattered anymore. The cold chicken and the cold truth went down about the same. Hard to swallow, and leaving a bitter aftertaste that no amount of fancy herbs could cover up. Victor Langston. Even his name tasted expensive when you said it out loud, like champagne mixed with the tears of middle-class workers. Billionaire real estate mogul. The kind of guy whose net worth has more zeros than my bank account has dollars. And trust me, that's saying something considering I've been counting pennies since our dishwasher died last spring, and Marissa insisted we needed the good one. That cost as much as a used car. Victor was the type of man who probably used $100 bills as bookmarks and thought people who flew commercial were engaging in some kind of extreme poverty tourism. The man called yachts boats, with this casual dismissiveness that made you want to punch him in his perfectly veneered teeth. Like owning a floating mansion with a helicopter pad was just normal everyday stuff. Equivalent to me owning a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a check engine light that's been on so long I've started thinking of it as a decorative feature. He'd say things like, "Oh, we're taking the boat out to the Mediterranean this weekend," as if he was talking about renting a canoe at the local lake. Meanwhile, I'm over here considering it a vacation when I get to sit in my backyard without having to mow the lawn. Victor genuinely, and I mean genuinely, believed that poor people only existed in history books, like we were dinosaurs or something that went extinct after the Reagan administration. You could see it in his eyes whenever he had to interact with anyone making less than six figures annually. This sort of confused fascination, like he'd stumbled into a museum exhibit called Common Folk, how they lived before everyone was rich. I'd bet my last dollar, and it might actually be my last dollar, that he thought poverty was just a choice people made because they hadn't read enough motivational books or attended the right networking brunches. I'd watched him at that Christmas party, holding court in the corner of the hotel ballroom they'd rented out, surrounded by people who laughed at everything he said like he was simultaneously performing Shakespeare and stand-up comedy. The bar had been open, premium stuff too, none of that liquor garbage, and I'd been nursing the same whiskey on the rocks for 40 minutes while observing Victor work his magic. And by magic, I mean flashing his money around like a peacock showing off its feathers. Except instead of feathers it was stories about his third vacation home in Aspen and his modest art collection that included a few Picassos, nothing major. But what really got me, what really twisted that knife in my gut and made me want to throw my drink at the ice sculpture shaped like their company logo, was watching Marissa around him. My wife. The woman who'd promised to love me through richer or poorer, and boy had we gotten intimately familiar with the poorer part. She'd transformed into someone I didn't recognize whenever Victor entered her orbit. Her laugh changed, became higher, more musical, like she was auditioning for the role of delighted socialite in a movie about people I'd never be able to afford to watch in theaters. I'd seen the way Marissa laughed at his jokes, and let me be crystal clear about something. His jokes weren't funny. Not even in that so bad it's good way that dad jokes occupy. They were the kind of jokes that only land when the person telling them has enough money to make you forget they have the personality of unseasoned chicken. He'd say something like, "Well, you know what they say about stocks. They're always up when you need them to be." And Marissa would practically double over with laughter, touching his forearm with her hand, the same hand that wore the wedding ring I'd saved for 3 months to buy 15 years ago. The jokes were literally just him making observations about being wealthy. That was the entire punchline. My accountant called today. Apparently, I made money while I was sleeping. Cue Marissa's giggles. I told my pilot the champagne was too warm. Can you believe it? More laughter from my wife, who once yelled at me for leaving the milk out for 10 minutes. This was the same woman who didn't laugh when I actually tried to be funny, when I'd make references to shows we used to watch together or bring up inside jokes from our early dating days. But Victor could basically read the stock market report, and she'd react like he'd just delivered the comedic performance of the century. It was the kind of laugh where she'd throw her head back slightly, exposing her neck in that way that body language experts probably write about in books titled How to Flirt Without Actually Saying You're Flirting. The kind where her eyes would crinkle at the corners, and she'd lean in just a fraction of an inch closer, like she was being pulled by some invisible wealthy magnet. I knew that laugh. That used to be my laugh, back when we were dating, when I was still interesting to her, before I became just another piece of furniture in her life, less noticeable than the couch and significantly less comfortable. The worst part wasn't even the laughing. The worst part was how she dressed for him, for their meetings, for their business dinners, for their client presentations, that somehow always seemed to happen at restaurants where the dress code was obscenely fancy and the portions were laughably small. Marissa would spend hours getting ready for these things, and I mean hours. She'd try on 5 different outfits, do her makeup 3 times, change her jewelry twice, spray on that perfume that cost more per ounce than my hourly wage. And the outfits. Sweet mercy, the outfits. She'd emerge from our bedroom looking like she was about to walk a red carpet, wearing dresses that hugged every curve like they were personally invested in showing off her figure to maximum effect. Heels that added 3 inches to her height and probably cost $300. Hair that she'd either blown out at the salon or spend an hour with the flat iron making look effortlessly elegant, which is code for, I tried really hard to look like I didn't try hard. The full production. Meanwhile, our 15th wedding anniversary last month, the big 1-5, supposedly a milestone worth celebrating, she'd shown up to dinner wearing jeans with a rip in the knee. Not the fashionable kind of rip, these jeans are actually just old kind, and a blouse she'd grabbed from the closet without even checking if it matched. No special effort. No hours of preparation. She'd spent maybe 15 minutes getting ready total, and that included the time she spent looking for her phone that was in her purse the whole time. We'd gone to that Italian place down the street, the one with the plastic tablecloths and the breadsticks that come free with your meal, and she'd checked her phone 7 times during dinner. I counted that too. I'm becoming really good at counting things that make me sad. You didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out what was happening here. You didn't need a deerstalker hat, a pipe, and a magnifying glass. You didn't need to live at 221B, Baker Street, or have a sidekick named Watson following you around taking notes. You just needed eyeballs. 2 functioning eyeballs and the basic cognitive ability to connect dots that were practically drawing lines between themselves, holding up neon signs that said, "Your wife is into her boss, you idiot." But I didn't want to be jealous. I really didn't. Because being jealous makes you the bad guy somehow. The insecure husband who can't handle his wife having a career, who can't handle her having a male boss, who's just threatened by successful men. Except I wasn't threatened by successful men in general. I was threatened by this specific successful man who my wife was treating like he'd personally invented humor and sophistication, while I sat at home with cold chicken wondering when exactly I'd become invisible in my own marriage. 15 years together. 15 years of building a life. Or at least that's what I thought we were doing. Turns out I was building while she was window shopping for upgrades. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me paint you a picture of just how much I'd invested in this marriage. And I'm not talking about emotional investment, though there was plenty of that too. I'm talking cold hard cash, sweat equity, and the kind of sacrifices that make you look back and wonder if you were actually a husband or just a really dedicated unpaid intern in the corporation of someone else's dreams. I'd worked overtime shifts that would make a coal miner say, "Dude, maybe take a break." We're talking 60, 70-hour weeks during the busy seasons, coming home so tired I'd fall asleep on the couch still wearing my work boots, too exhausted to even make it upstairs to the bedroom. My boss loved me because I never said no. "Chris, can you cover Saturday?" "Sure." "Chris, can you stay late?" "Absolutely." "Chris, can you sell your soul and any remaining dignity?" "Already done, sir. Signed the paperwork last Tuesday." I'd taken every extra shift, every holiday overtime opportunity, every chance to make a few more bucks because Marissa had dreams, and dreams cost money. We'd skipped vacations for years. And I don't mean we'd skipped going to Europe or taking cruises or any of that fancy stuff. I mean we'd skipped basic, normal people vacations. While my coworkers were taking their families to the beach for a week or driving to Disneyland to traumatize themselves with overpriced churros and 4-hour wait times, I was telling Marissa, maybe next year, honey, and watching her face do that thing where she smiled but her eyes didn't, like a hostage in a proof-of-life video. Every year, it was the same story. We need to save for the house repairs. We need to build up the emergency fund. We need to pay off that credit card. The emergency fund, by the way, was eternally one emergency away from being empty, which kind of defeats the purpose, but that's poverty math for you. I'd sold my car once. My car. The 2006 Mustang I'd bought before we got married, the one thing I'd owned that made me feel like I was something more than just a guy trudging through life one paycheck at a time. That car was my baby. I'd named her Stella, washed her every Sunday, knew every quirk of her engine like she was a temperamental girlfriend who was worth the hassle. But Marissa wanted her dream kitchen. And by dream kitchen, I mean she'd seen something on HGTV during one of those renovation shows, where people with mysteriously unlimited budgets turn normal rooms into spaces that belong in architecture magazines. She'd wanted the granite countertops, the farmhouse sink, the custom cabinets with the soft closed doors that didn't slam. She'd wanted the fancy stainless steel appliances that matched, the kind where even the trash compactor looks like it went to finishing school. She'd made Pinterest boards, plural, multiple boards dedicated to kitchens that cost more than most people's annual salary. She'd shown me pictures every night for 2 months, pointing at screens and saying things like, "Isn't this subway tile gorgeous?" And "We absolutely need pendant lighting over the island." So I'd sold Stella, put an ad online, met some kid in a parking lot who had the cash and the dream I was giving up, and handed over the keys to the only thing I'd ever owned that made me feel like less of a failure. I'd walked home that day with a check in my pocket and a hole in my chest. But hey, at least Marissa got her dream kitchen. The kitchen she now barely cooked in because she was always too busy working late or going to business dinners or, apparently, dressing up like a Bond girl to hang out with her billionaire boss. And how did she thank me for all this? How did she show appreciation for the overtime, the skipped vacations, the sold car, the years of putting her wants above my needs? By treating Victor Langston like he was the second coming of Christ mixed with Ryan Gosling and a lottery win. By spending more time on her appearance for a random Tuesday meeting than she'd spent getting ready for our wedding anniversary. By making me feel like I was competing in a race where the other guy started at the finish line and I was still looking for my shoes. Meanwhile, the nicest thing she'd worn for me in the past 3 years. And yes, I'd been keeping a mental tally because apparently I'm a masochist who enjoys documenting his own irrelevance, was a hoodie that said, "World's Okayest Wife." She'd gotten it as a gag gift from her sister during last year's Christmas exchange, and she'd thrown it on one Saturday morning when we'd planned to just hang out and watch movies. That was it. That was the peak of her dressing up for me. A joke hoodie that literally announced she was mediocre at being married to me. The hoodie was funny, I'll give it that. I'd even laughed when she'd opened it, when her sister had cackled and said, "I saw this and immediately thought of you." We'd all laughed. Haha, Marissa's an okay wife. What a hilarious observation. Except it wasn't just funny anymore. It was painfully, brutally, devastatingly accurate. She was the world's okayest wife, and that was on her good days. On her bad days, she was barely clearing the bar of technically still married. That hoodie should have come with a warning label. Caution, this humorous garment will become a prophecy. Your wife will literally embody okayness while reserving all her actual effort for her rich boss. Side effects may include cold chicken, emotional neglect, and the sudden realization that you've been playing yourself for over a decade. I'd sacrificed everything I could think of to make her happy, to build the life she wanted, to be the husband she deserved. I'd worked myself to the bone, literally gave up the things that brought me joy, postponed my own dreams indefinitely. And for what? So she could have the perfect backdrop for her affair? So Victor could benefit from the improved version of Marissa that my money had helped create? It was like I'd been renovating a house that someone else was going to move into. I'd done all the hard work, paid for all the upgrades, fixed all the problems, and now some billionaire was going to swoop in and enjoy the finished product. The math wasn't mathing, as the kids say. I'd put in 15 years of effort, sacrifice, and dedication. I'd been the reliable one, the steady one, the one who showed up every single day, even when showing up was the last thing I wanted to do. And my return on investment? A wife who kept secrets, told lies, and apparently thought I was too stupid or too trusting to notice that she'd checked out of our marriage somewhere around the time Victor Langston had checked into her life. Every time I'd said, "We can't afford that right now," I'd been thinking about our future together. Our retirement, our stability, our rainy day fund. Turns out Marissa had been thinking about how much longer she had to wait before she could trade up to someone who'd never have to say, "We can't afford that." Someone who'd say, "Buy whatever you want," and mean it, because money wasn't real to people like Victor. It was just a score in a game where he'd already won. I'd given her everything I had, and it still wasn't enough. Couldn't be enough. Because I was competing against a guy who could give her everything anyone could ever want without even noticing the expense. How do you compete with that? How do you fight against someone who can buy your wife's attention with the pocket change he'd find in his yacht? You can't. You just can't. And maybe that's what hurt the most, knowing that all my sacrifice meant nothing when stacked up against Victor's effortless wealth. The dream kitchen mocked me every time I walked through it now. Those granite countertops, those soft-close cabinets, that farmhouse sink, they'd cost me Stella and so much more. And for what? So Marissa could ignore them while she got dressed up for another man? The kitchen sat there, beautiful and unused, just like our marriage. Perfect on the surface, empty where it counted, and costing way more than it was worth. I'd been suspicious for weeks. Not just garden variety, that's weird, suspicious, but full-blown detective mode suspicious. The kind where you start noticing patterns and inconsistencies that would make a conspiracy theorist look casual. The late-night texts she'd hide by tilting her phone away from me. The sudden emergency meetings that somehow always required her best dress, and that perfume she only wore for special occasions. The way she'd started saying, "I love you," with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for reading terms and conditions agreements. All the signs were there, written in neon letters 10 feet tall. But I'd been in denial because admitting your marriage is circling the drain feels about as fun as a root canal performed by a dentist with anger management issues. But denial only works for so long before reality smacks you in the face with the force of a freight train carrying a load of truth bombs. So about 3 weeks ago, when Marissa had come home from another late meeting smelling like cologne that definitely wasn't sold at Target, I'd made a decision. If I was going down, I was going down swinging. And I was going to be prepared. I wasn't going to be the idiot husband who discovers his wife's affair and then scrambles around trying to figure out what to do while she's already 10 steps ahead with her own game plan. That's when I called Marcus. Marcus Chun, my lawyer buddy from college, the guy who'd somehow survived freshman year as my roommate when I was going through my learning to cook phase that resulted in 3 fire alarms and 1 evacuation of our entire dorm building. We'd stayed friends through the years, though our lives had taken wildly different paths. He'd gone to law school, graduated with honors, and now ran his own practice specializing in family law. I'd gone into warehouse management and specialized in developing stress ulcers. But Marcus was solid, the kind of guy who'd help you move a body if you called him at 3 in the morning, though he'd also strongly advise you to call the police instead, because that's the legal thing to do. Marcus was the kind of lawyer who smelled like paperwork and bad coffee. And I mean that in the most affectionate way possible. His office was this cramped space above a dry cleaner in a strip mall that had seen better days, probably around 1987. The carpet was that industrial gray that exists solely in places where hope goes to die. And his desk was buried under stacks of folders and legal documents that seemed to breed when you weren't looking. He had exactly 1 plant, a sad little succulent that was somehow struggling to survive despite the fact that succulents are literally designed to thrive on neglect. If that plant was a metaphor for anything, I didn't want to think about what. But here's the thing about Marcus, he got results. He didn't have the fancy downtown office with the view and the receptionist who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. He didn't have the leather furniture or the expensive art on the walls or any of that stuff that screams, "I charge $500 an hour, and I'm worth it." What he had was a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and absolutely brutal when it came to protecting his clients. He'd once told me over beers that divorce law wasn't about feelings, it was about assets, and he treated every case like a military campaign with clear objectives and no mercy for the enemy. I called him on a Wednesday afternoon during my lunch break, sitting in my car in the parking lot, because I didn't want anyone overhearing this conversation. I felt ridiculous at first, like I was being paranoid or jumping to conclusions. But then I'd thought about that black dress, that cologne, those late-night meetings, and the ridiculousness had evaporated pretty quickly. Marcus had answered on the second ring with his usual greeting. "Marcus Chun, this better be important because I'm eating a sandwich." I'd laid it all out for him. The suspicious behavior, the boss, the obvious lies that Marissa apparently thought I was too stupid to see through. Marcus had listened without interrupting, which I appreciated because I was on a roll and I needed to get it all out before I lost my nerve. When I'd finished, there'd been a pause, and then he'd said, "Chris, my friend, I'm going to ask you one question and I need you to be honest with me. Are you sure? Because once we start this process, it's going to get ugly. Divorces always do, but when there's potential infidelity involved, it becomes a whole different beast." I'd been sure, surer than I'd been about anything in years. So Marcus had told me what we needed to do. He'd need evidence, documentation, a paper trail. He'd told me to start keeping records of everything. Time she left, time she came home, any texts or emails I could access, credit card statements showing dinners at expensive restaurants, anything that could establish a pattern. He'd also recommended a private investigator, but that felt like a step too far, too much like something out of a movie. Plus, those guys charged rates that would have bankrupted me faster than Marissa's kitchen renovation. We'd settled on a simpler plan. Marcus would prepare the divorce papers, have them ready to go, and we'd wait for the right moment. He'd explained that timing mattered in these situations, that serving someone with divorce papers when they weren't expecting it gave you a psychological advantage. It caught them off guard, made them reactive instead of proactive. You want to control the narrative, he'd said. Right now, she thinks she's in control. She thinks she's getting away with it. We're going to change that calculation real fast. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus had worked his magic while I'd played the role of oblivious husband. It had been harder than I'd expected, pretending everything was fine while gathering evidence of my marriage falling apart. I'd screenshotted text messages where she'd said she was working late, while her location showed her at restaurants across town. I'd photographed receipts I'd found in her purse for places we'd never been together. I'd documented every lie, every inconsistency, every moment that proved what I already knew in my gut. Marcus had put together a divorce filing that was, in his words, aggressive but fair. He wasn't trying to destroy Marissa financially. Despite everything, I didn't want to ruin her life. I just wanted out of the marriage. But he'd made sure to include documentation of my financial contributions, the sacrifices I'd made, the car I'd sold for her dream kitchen. Judge might not care about the emotional stuff, Marcus had said, but they definitely care about who put what into the marriage. You've been funding her lifestyle while she's been stepping out. That matters. The papers had been ready for a week, sitting in Marcus's office in a manila folder with my name on it, just waiting for the right moment. And that moment had come tonight, when Marissa had walked out in that black dress, lying through her teeth about Chili's and ladies' night. The audacity of it, the sheer brazen confidence that I'd just accept her obvious lie, had been the final straw. I'd texted Marcus from the living room, sitting there with my cold chicken and colder marriage. She's out with him. Do it. The reply had come back almost immediately. Just a thumbs-up emoji. No words needed. That single emoji contained multitudes, confirmation, solidarity, the promise of action. It was the coldest thumbs up I'd ever seen, and I'd seen some pretty cold ones in my day. It was the thumbs up of a man who was about to launch a legal missile at someone's life. It was the thumbs up of preparation meeting opportunity. It was the thumbs up that said, game on, let's burn this thing down. While Marissa was out there sipping cocktails with Mr. Moneybags, probably laughing at his terrible jokes and pretending she wasn't married, I was sitting at home arming the nukes. Metaphorical nukes. Obviously, the legal kind that came in the form of properly filed paperwork and a process server who knew how to find people. Marcus had already arranged everything. The process server was on standby, a woman named Janet who apparently had a 100% success rate and could find anyone anywhere. She'd serve Marissa tonight when she came home, catch her right in that moment when she walked in thinking she'd gotten away with it again. The beauty of it was the timing. Marissa thought she was in control, thought she was managing 2 lives, her real life with Victor and her fake life with me. She thought she had time to figure out her exit strategy, time to plan her escape, time to make sure she got everything she wanted from both situations. She had no idea that her time had just run out, that while she was out there living her fantasy, reality was preparing to crash through the door like a SWAT team with legal documents. Marcus had warned me it wouldn't feel good, even though it was the right thing to do. Revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, he'd said, but divorce is just sad all around, even when someone deserves it. He was probably right. This whole thing was sad. 15 years ending not with a conversation or a mutual decision, but with a surprise process server and legal paperwork. But you know what was sadder? Spending another 15 years with someone who thought I was too stupid to notice she'd checked out of our marriage. So I waited, sat there in the dim living room, phone in hand, knowing that Janet the process server was somewhere out there in the night, ready to spring into action. Marcus had said she'd wait nearby, watch for Marissa to come home, give it a few minutes for her to get inside, and then knock on the door. Professional, efficient, devastating. The nuclear option, deployed with precision. My phone buzzed. Marcus, Janet's in position. ETA on target. I typed back. Soon. She's never out past midnight on weeknights. Another message. We got this, brother. You're doing the right thing. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to feel confident and righteous and sure of my decision. Instead, I just felt tired and sad and a little bit sick to my stomach. But sometimes the right thing doesn't feel good. Sometimes it just feels necessary. Waiting for Marissa to come home felt like waiting for a bomb to go off. Except I was the one who'd set the timer, and now I was just sitting here watching the seconds tick down, questioning every life choice that had led me to this exact moment. The living room had taken on this weird quality where everything looked both familiar and completely foreign at the same time, like I was seeing my own life through someone else's eyes and realizing how sad the whole picture looked. The couch where we used to watch movies together on Friday nights before she got too busy for movie nights. The TV we'd fought about buying because I'd wanted to save money and she'd wanted the bigger screen. The coffee table with the ring stains from all the times we'd forgotten to use coasters. Every object in this room had a history, and all those histories were about to become just memories. I'd turn off most of the lights, leaving just the one lamp on in the corner, the one with the shade that was slightly crooked because I'd bumped into it last month and never bothered to straighten it out. The dim lighting made everything look more dramatic, like I was in some film noir movie where the detective sits in the shadows waiting for the femme fatale to walk into his trap. Except this wasn't a movie. This was my life imploding in real time, and there was nothing glamorous or cool about it. It just felt hollow and sad, and like I was mourning something that had probably been dead for a while, but I'd been too stubborn or too stupid to admit it. My eyes kept drifting to the mantel above the fireplace we never used because Marissa said real fireplaces were outdated and inefficient, and we should just get one of those electric ones that looked real but didn't actually produce heat or require any effort. On that mantel, in a silver frame that had probably cost more than it should have, sat our wedding photo. The wedding photo. The one that was supposed to represent the beginning of our forever. The moment when two people decided that out of all the humans on this planet, they wanted to annoying each other exclusively for the rest of their lives. I stood up and walked over to it, picked up the frame, and carried it back to the couch. Sat down with it in my lap like it was a yearbook from a school I'd graduated from a lifetime ago. The photo stared back at me, frozen in time, preserving a moment of hope and happiness that felt so foreign now it might as well have been someone else's wedding entirely. There I was, 28 years old, and looking like I'd raided a thrift store's formal section 5 minutes before the ceremony. The tux was rented, obviously, because buying a tux when you're barely making ends meet is the kind of financial decision that keeps you barely making ends meet forever. But it wasn't just rented, it was rented poorly. The thing was at least 2 sizes too big, maybe 3. The shoulders hung off me like I was a kid playing dress-up in his dad's clothes. The sleeves covered half my hands. The pants had been hemmed in what I can only assume was an emergency situation involving a stapler and someone's grandmother who'd assured everyone she used to sew. I'd felt like a fraud that day, standing at the altar in a suit that didn't fit, making promises I wasn't sure I could keep, hoping that love would be enough to compensate for the fact that I couldn't afford to give Marissa the life she probably deserved. My hair had been slicked back with too much gel because I'd panicked that morning and used way more than necessary, resulting in a look that screamed, trying too hard, meets, gave up halfway through. My smile in the photo was genuine though, I'd give myself that. I'd been happy. Terrified, broke, swimming in an oversized tux, but genuinely happy because I'd thought I was marrying my best friend and we'd figure out the rest together. And then there was Marissa. Marissa in her lace wedding gown that had cost more than my car at the time, more than 3 months of my rent, more than seemed reasonable for a dress you'd wear exactly once. But she'd been adamant about it, had dragged me to 4 different bridal shops, had tried on what felt like hundreds of dresses while I sat in uncomfortable chairs designated for grooms and fathers, nodding supportively and pretending I could tell the difference between ivory and champagne and off-white. The dress had been beautiful, I couldn't deny that. All that lace and beading and whatever else made wedding dresses cost as much as used cars. It had fit her perfectly, custom-tailored to her exact measurements, hugging her in all the right places and flowing dramatically in all the places where flowing dramatically was apparently important. Her hair had been up in some complicated arrangement that had required a professional and 3 hours of work. Her makeup had been done by someone who charged by the hour and made her look like a movie star, flawless and radiant, and so far out of my league, it wasn't even funny. She'd sworn to me while she was trying on dresses, while I was quietly calculating how many overtime shifts I'd need to pick up to afford this wedding, that she'd never outshine me. That was the phrase she'd used, standing in that bridal shop, holding my hand and looking into my eyes with what I'd thought was sincerity. I don't want to outshine you on our wedding day, Chris. We're a team, remember? Equal partners. I'd believed her because I'd been young and in love and stupid, the trifecta of bad decision-making. But looking at this photo now, 15 years later, sitting in the dark with divorce papers about to be served, I could see the truth I'd been too blinded by love to see back then. She'd absolutely outshone me that night. Hadn't just outshone me, she'd eclipsed me, obliterated me, made me look like the weird side character in the story of her perfect wedding day. And she'd never stopped. That wedding had set the tone for our entire marriage. Her in the spotlight, looking perfect, commanding attention. Me in the ill-fitting suit, trying to keep up, always just a little bit behind, always just a little bit less than what the scene required. Every single person at that wedding had looked at us and thought the same thing. I could see it now in hindsight. They'd thought she's out of his league, and how did he land her? And probably give it 5 years tops. Well, joke's on them. We'd made it 15. 15 years of me trying to measure up, trying to be enough, trying to fit into a life that was tailored for someone else while I was swimming in fabric that wasn't meant for me. I traced my finger over the glass covering Marissa's face in the photo. She looked so happy in that moment, and maybe she had been. Maybe she'd genuinely loved me back then, before I'd become just another disappointing reality in a life full of compromises. Or maybe she'd always been looking past me, even on our wedding day, already imagining someone better, someone richer, someone who'd actually fit properly in an expensive tux because he owned several of them. The lace dress in the photo seemed to mock me now. All that money, all that effort, all that perfection for a marriage that was about to end via process server and legal documents. We'd spent more on her dress than we'd spent on our honeymoon. We'd gone to a cabin in the mountains for 3 days because that's all we could afford after the wedding expenses. She'd complained the whole time about the lack of cell phone service and the fact that the cabin didn't have a jacuzzi tub. I'd thought she was joking at first, but she hadn't been. Even on our honeymoon, I hadn't been enough. I looked at younger me in that photo, with my 2 big tucks and my hopeful smile and my complete ignorance about what the next 15 years would bring. Part of me wanted to reach through time and warn him, tell him to run, to save himself, to understand that some gaps can't be bridged by love alone. But another part of me knew that younger me wouldn't have listened. He'd been too in love, too optimistic, too convinced that he could make it work through sheer determination and overtime shifts. Guess what lace dress? I whispered to the photo, my voice sounding strange in the quiet living room. The words came out bitter, laced with all the disappointment and anger and hurt that had been building up for weeks, maybe months, maybe years if I was being honest with myself. Forever just got repoed. It was a stupid thing to say to a photograph, talking to an inanimate object like it could hear me or care or do anything except sit there being a captured moment that would never change no matter how much the reality had. But it felt good to say it out loud, to acknowledge that the promise we'd made in that photo, the forever we'd committed to in front of all our friends and family, and a God I wasn't even sure I believed in, was over, repossessed, taken back, returned to sender with insufficient postage. The dress couldn't respond, obviously, because it was a dress in a photo from 15 years ago. But if it could have, I imagine it would have said something like, "I tried to warn you with my price tag," or "Did you really think this was going to work?" Or maybe just "You should have gone with the cheaper venue and used the extra money for marriage counseling." I set the photo face down on the coffee table. Couldn't look at it anymore. Couldn't stare at those 2 kids who'd thought they had it all figured out, who'd thought love conquered all, who'd been wrong about pretty much everything. The frame made a soft thump against the wood, final and definitive, like closing a book you'd never open again. My phone buzzed. "Marcus, Janet says she just pulled into a restaurant parking lot downtown. Looks like our target is wrapping up dinner." I texted back, "Let me know when she's heading home." The response was immediate. "Will do. How you holding up?" I didn't know how to answer that, so I just sent back a thumbs up, the universal symbol for, I'm definitely not okay, but I don't want to talk about it. The wedding photo lay face down on the table, and somehow that felt appropriate. That version of us was over, face down and finished. Whatever came next, whoever I became after tonight, he wouldn't be the guy in the too big tux making promises he couldn't keep. He'd be someone different, someone smarter, someone who knew that sometimes love isn't enough, and lace dresses are just expensive fabric, and forever is just a word people say when they haven't lived long enough to know better. She finally walked in around 11:30, which was actually earlier than I'd expected. Maybe Victor had another commitment, or maybe even billionaires have bedtimes, or maybe she'd felt a twinge of guilt about leaving her husband alone on a Tuesday night with nothing but cold chicken and colder suspicions for company. Whatever the reason, I heard her car pull into the driveway, heard the engine cut off, heard her heels clicking on the concrete path that led to our front door. Each click sounded like a countdown, like the universe was tapping out the final seconds of our marriage in Morse code. The door opened, and there she was, backlit by the porch light I'd forgotten to turn off, looking like she'd just stepped out of a movie about beautiful people doing beautiful things in beautiful places that guys like me only saw in magazines. The black dress still looked perfect, not a wrinkle in sight, which seemed impossible after what I assumed had been hours of sitting in some overpriced restaurant booth. Her hair was still immaculate, that professional blowout holding strong against humidity and time and the general entropy of the universe. Her makeup was flawless, not a smudge or a smear, like she'd been specially coated in some kind of cosmetic force field. But the thing that really got me, the detail that felt like a knife twisting in my gut, was the smell. She smelled like champagne and expensive cologne that definitely, absolutely, 100% wasn't mine. My cologne came from Target and smelled like Fresh Sport, or Mountain Timber, or whatever masculine scent they'd decided to bottle that season for 1999. This cologne was different, sophisticated, complex, probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce, cost more per ounce than my hourly wage. It hung around her like a cloud of evidence, like she'd been dipped in the proof of her betrayal, and then walked into our house expecting me not to notice. She froze when she saw me sitting there in the dim light, and I watched her face go through this rapid series of calculations. Surprised that I was still awake, concerned about what that might mean. Then the quick recovery, the snap back to normalcy, the mask sliding into place so fast you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it. And I'd been looking for it. I'd been studying her tells and her patterns and her lies for weeks now. I was basically a graduate student in the field of Marissa's deception, and I was about to defend my thesis. "Chris, you're still awake?" she asked, and her voice had that carefully constructed casualness that people use when they're trying way too hard to sound normal. It was the vocal equivalent of someone whistling while walking past a crime scene they'd definitely committed. She set her clutch down on the table by the door, that expensive little purse that matched her expensive little dress that she'd worn to her expensive little date with her expensive boss. The purse made a soft thud that sounded way too loud in the quiet house. Her fake smile was plastered on her face like a billboard advertisement for "everything is fine, nothing to see here." It was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, didn't involve any genuine happiness, was really just her mouth making the shape of a smile while the rest of her face stayed in neutral. I'd seen that smile a lot lately. It was her default expression for me now, the one she used when she was present physically but checked out mentally, already thinking about her next meeting or her next text or her next whatever the hell she did when she wasn't being my wife. Before I could answer her question, and honestly, what was I going to say? "Yeah, I'm awake because I'm waiting for you to get served with divorce papers. How was your totally not a date with Victor?" There was a knock at the door. Not a doorbell ring, but an actual knock. 3 solid raps that sounded official and intentional and exactly like what I'd been waiting for all night. Marissa's eyebrows did this little confused scrunch thing. "Who would be knocking this late?" she asked, and there was genuine puzzlement in her voice because she wasn't expecting this. She had no idea what was about to happen. She thought she was in control of the situation, thought she was managing both her lives successfully, thought she'd gotten away with another night of whatever she was doing with Victor. The ignorance would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. She turned and opened the door, probably expecting a neighbor with a package or maybe someone lost looking for directions. Instead, there stood Janet, the process server, and let me tell you, Janet was exactly what you'd picture if someone asked you to imagine a woman who'd perfected the art of ruining people's nights. She was in her 50s, wearing a professional pantsuit that said, "I'm here on business," carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained more life-changing documents than most people would see in a decade. She had this no-nonsense expression that I imagined she'd developed after years of watching people's faces crumble when she handed them papers. "Mrs. Marissa Kane?" Janet asked, her voice crisp and efficient, like she was reading from a script she'd performed 1,000 times. And maybe she had. Marcus said she had a 100% success rate, which meant she'd done this enough times to be really, really good at it. Marissa stepped forward, still confused, still not getting it. "Yes," she said, drawing out the word like a question, like maybe if she said it uncertainly enough, this whole situation would reveal itself to be a misunderstanding or a prank or anything other than what it actually was. Janet held out an envelope, a standard manila envelope that looked completely innocuous, like it could contain anything. A birthday card, a thank you note, a menu from a new restaurant. Except it didn't contain any of those things. It contained the end of a marriage, typed up in legal terminology and filed with the county clerk and signed by my lawyer, who smelled like bad coffee and got results. "You've been served," Janet said, and those 3 words hung in the air like a verdict. She didn't say it meanly or cruelly or with any particular emotion at all. She said it the way someone might say, "Here's your mail," or "Sign here, please." Matter of fact. Professional. Final. Marissa took the envelope automatically. That reflex we all have to accept things that are handed to us, and I watched as her brain tried to process what was happening. Her hand was shaking slightly as she held the envelope, not a lot. Just a tiny tremor that most people wouldn't notice, but I did because I'd been married to this woman for 15 years, and I knew all her physical tells. Her jaw dropped. Actually dropped. Like in cartoons when characters are shocked and their mouths just fall open. Except this wasn't a cartoon. This was real life, and that was my wife's face going through the stages of realization. Confusion gave way to shock. Shock gave way to disbelief, and disbelief was settling into something that looked a lot like panic. Her eyes went wide, the carefully applied mascara and eyeliner framing her shock in high definition. The envelope in her hands might as well have been a live grenade. She stared at it like it might explode at any second, which in a way, I guess it already had. The paper bomb had already detonated. The damage was already done. She just hadn't fully processed the impact yet. Her perfect hair and perfect dress and perfect makeup suddenly looked ridiculous, like she'd dressed up fancy for a party only to discover it was actually a funeral. The funeral of our marriage. Janet stood there for another moment, professionally waiting to make sure Marissa had actually received the documents and wasn't going to try to hand them back or throw them at her or do any of the things people apparently sometimes did when they got served. But Marissa just stood there, frozen, staring at the envelope like it was written in a language she couldn't read. "Have a good evening," Janet said, which was either incredibly polite or incredibly sarcastic. I couldn't tell which. Maybe both. Maybe when you serve divorce papers for a living, you develop a dark sense of humor about the whole thing. She turned and walked back down our front path, her job completed, her 100% success rate maintained, leaving behind the wreckage of whatever Marissa had thought was going to happen when she'd walked through that door. Marissa slowly closed the door, moving like she was underwater, like the air had suddenly become thick and resistant. She turned back to look at me, the envelope still clutched in her hand, and her face was doing things I'd never seen before. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish gasping for air, trying to form words that wouldn't come. The fake smile was completely gone now, replaced by raw shock and the beginning stages of panic. "Chris," she finally managed to say, my name coming out strangled and confused. "Chris, what is this?" I leaned back on the couch, and I'm not going to lie, there was a part of me that felt a sick satisfaction at seeing her so completely thrown off balance. After weeks of watching her lie to my face, after months of feeling like I was going crazy for noticing things she thought I was too stupid to see, after years of coming second to everything and everyone else in her life, this moment of her being the one who was confused and scared and not in control felt like a small victory. "That," I said, my voice surprisingly steady considering my heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon, "is divorce papers." I believe the technical term is petition for dissolution of marriage, but I prefer to think of it as my official resignation from the position of world's most gullible husband. Her face went pale, and I mean pale. Whatever color sheet had drained out so fast I briefly worried she might actually faint right there in our entryway. The envelope slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor, landing with a soft whisper that seemed way too quiet for something that represented the destruction of 15 years. "You can't. We need to talk about this," she stammered, and the irony of her wanting to talk now, after months of not talking, after countless nights of lies and secrets, would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. "Oh, now you want to talk?" I said, and I could hear the bitterness in my own voice, sharp and cutting. "That's funny, because you haven't wanted to talk for months. You've wanted to work late, wanted to attend meetings, wanted to have ladies' nights at places that aren't actually Chili's. But talk to me, your husband? That hasn't been on your agenda." She bent down to pick up the envelope with shaking hands, and I watched her expensive cologne cloud follow her movements, reminding me exactly why we were here. Marissa sputtered excuses faster than a politician caught in a scandal during election season. And let me tell you, she had the same desperate energy as someone whose entire career was about to go down in flames on live television. The words tumbled out of her mouth in this rapid-fire sequence that would have been impressive if it wasn't so pathetically predictable. Her hands were waving around as she talked, gesturing wildly like she was trying to physically push her explanations into my brain, force me to accept them through sheer momentum and hand movements. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice climbing an octave into that pitch that dogs can probably hear. That was always the first line in the cheater's playbook, wasn't it? Right there on page 1, highlighted and underlined. "It's not what you think. A liar's guide to gaslighting your spouse." I'd heard that line in a million movies, read it in countless books, and now here it was in my living room, delivered by my wife in a black dress that still smelled like another man's cologne. "Really?" I said, crossing my arms and leaning back further into the couch, settling in for what I knew was going to be a world-class performance of mental gymnastics. "So you didn't just come home from a romantic dinner with your billionaire boss while lying to me about going to Chili's? Because that's what I think happened. But please, enlighten me. Tell me what actually happened that's somehow completely different from the obvious reality that's standing in front of me, wearing a dress that costs more than our car payment." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She looked like she was trying to buffer, like her brain was a computer that had encountered an error and was now just spinning its wheels trying to load an excuse that would make any sense. The envelope full of divorce papers was still clutched in her hand, wrinkling under her grip, and I noticed her perfectly manicured nails digging into the manila paper hard enough to leave little crescent marks. "We were just talking," she finally said, and even she didn't sound convinced by her own words. They came out weak and unconvincing, like she'd grabbed the first explanation off the shelf without checking if it was expired. "Victor needed to discuss some business matters, and it was easier to do it over dinner than in the office where there are constant interruptions. It was completely professional, Chris. Completely innocent." I laughed. I actually laughed, and once I started, I couldn't stop. It built up from somewhere deep in my chest and came out in these harsh barks of sound that didn't contain any actual humor, just bitter recognition of absurdity. I laughed so hard I nearly sprained something, possibly my sense of disbelief, which had been working overtime for months now and was probably due for workers' compensation. "Professional," I repeated, still chuckling darkly. "Yeah, because dinner with your rich boss in a candlelit restaurant is obviously just a business meeting. That's why you wore that dress, right? The one that screams, 'Let's discuss quarterly reports and profit margins.'" "You've been distant, Chris," she said, and oh boy, here came the blame shifting. Right on schedule. Act 2 of the cheater's playbook. Make it somehow the betrayed person's fault. I needed attention. I needed to feel appreciated, valued, like I mattered to someone. "When was the last time you took me out to a nice dinner? When was the last time you dressed up for me? When was the last time you made me feel special?" This was the part where I was supposed to feel guilty, I guess. This was where I was supposed to recognize my failures as a husband and take responsibility for pushing her into the arms, or expensive restaurants, of another man. This was where the script usually had the husband breaking down and apologizing and begging for another chance while promising to do better. But you know what? I'd seen this movie before, and I was tired of playing my assigned role. Distant, I said, and my voice came out low and dangerous, like distant thunder promising a storm. I stood up from the couch, and Marissa actually took a step back, probably picking up on the energy that was radiating off me in waves. Distant? Lady, I worked 3 jobs to keep this roof over our heads. 3 jobs. Do you know what that's like? Do you have any concept of what it means to work 60, 70 hours a week? I was on a roll now, and weeks of suppressed anger and hurt and frustration were coming out in a torrent that I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. The only thing I've been distant from is sleep. I've been distant from hobbies, from friends, from anything that resembles a life outside of working myself into an early grave so you could have your dream kitchen and your nice things and your comfortable lifestyle. I sold my car, Marissa. My car. The only thing I owned that made me feel like I was something more than just a paycheck with legs. And I did it so you could have granite countertops and custom cabinets. She tried to interrupt, but I wasn't done. Not even close. 15 years of being second place, of being taken for granted, of sacrificing everything while getting nothing in return. All of it was coming out now like pressure released from a valve that had been sealed too tight for too long. I skipped vacations. I continued, my voice getting louder. Remember vacations? Those things normal couples take? I worked overtime instead. I picked up extra shifts on holidays while you complained about being bored. I did everything I could think of to give you the life you wanted. And you're standing here telling me I've been distant? You know what's distant? Your appreciation, your loyalty, your basic human decency to not screw around with your boss while your husband is at home making you dinner that gets cold because you're too busy lying about where you are. Marissa's eyes were wide now, and I could see tears forming, but I was past the point of caring about her tears. She'd made her choices, and now she got to live with the consequences. Crying wasn't going to change the divorce papers she was holding. Tears weren't going to erase the months of lies and betrayal. I needed attention, she said again, her voice small now, the tears starting to roll down her cheeks and taking her expensive mascara with them. Black streaks formed on her face, ruining the perfect makeup she'd spent so much time applying for Victor. You were always working. You were never home. And when you were home, you were tired or stressed or distant. Victor made me feel seen. He made me feel beautiful and important and rich. I cut her off. Don't forget rich. Victor made you feel rich. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? Not attention or appreciation or any of that Hallmark card garbage you're trying to sell me right now. It's about money. It's about the fact that he can take you to restaurants where the menu doesn't have prices, and I take you to places with happy hour specials. It's about the fact that he drives a car that costs more than our house, and I drive a Honda that's one blown gasket away from being classified as lawn art. She shook her head, but the denial was weak. We both knew I was right. We both knew that if Victor was a middle manager at some insurance company making 50 grand a year, she wouldn't have been laughing at his terrible jokes or spending 3 hours getting ready for their business meetings. Money was the elephant in the room, the third party in our marriage, the thing that had always been between us even when we pretended it didn't matter. I love you, she said, and those 3 words that used to mean everything now meant absolutely nothing. They were just sounds coming out of her mouth, syllables arranged in a familiar pattern but devoid of any actual truth or weight. Chris, I love you. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can. No, I said, and the word came out flat and final. No, we can't. Because you know what, Marissa? I don't believe you. I don't believe you love me. I don't even think you like me very much. I think you like what I provide. I think you like having a stable home and a reliable husband who works himself to death while you explore your options with men who can give you more. But love? Real love? The kind that doesn't involve lying and cheating and treating your partner like they're too stupid to notice what's happening? No, you don't love me. Maybe you never did. She was full-on crying now, makeup completely destroyed, shoulders shaking with sobs that I might have found moving if I hadn't been completely numbed by the last few months of suspicion and tonight's confirmation of everything I'd feared. The black dress that had looked so perfect when she'd walked in now seemed ridiculous, inappropriate, like she was wearing a costume to a party she hadn't been invited to. Please, she whispered, and her voice cracked on the word. Please, Chris, don't do this. We can fix this. I made a mistake. I'll quit my job. I'll never see Victor again. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't leave me. And there it was. The begging stage. The promises of change. The desperate bargaining that happened when someone realized they were about to lose something they'd taken for granted. But here's the thing about promises made in panic. They're worth about as much as her promise to never outshine me at our wedding. Which is to say, they're worth nothing at all. You know what you can do, I said, my voice tired now, the anger draining out and leaving behind just exhaustion and sadness. You can sign those papers. You can get yourself a good lawyer. Maybe Victor can recommend one. I'm sure he knows several. And you can start figuring out your next move. Because this is done. She clutched the envelope to her chest like it was something precious instead of something that represented the end of everything we'd built together. Or everything I'd built while she'd been shopping for someone better. The tears kept flowing, and part of me, a small, stupid part that still remembered loving her, wanted to comfort her. But that part was overruled by the larger, smarter part that knew I deserved better than this. The kids took it hard, which was the understatement of the century, and probably the only thing in this entire nightmare that actually surprised me. I'd been so focused on my own pain, my own betrayal, my own justified anger that I'd somehow managed to compartmentalize the fact that this divorce wasn't just going to affect me and Marissa. It was going to absolutely demolish our children's understanding of stability and family, and the idea that their parents' marriage was one of the few constants they could rely on in an otherwise chaotic world. We'd sat them down the next morning at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had countless family dinners and homework sessions and birthday cake celebrations. The table where we'd pretended to be a functional, happy family for 15 years. Marissa sat on one side, her eyes still puffy and red from crying all night, looking like she'd aged about 10 years in the span of 12 hours. I sat on the other side, probably looking equally destroyed but trying to maintain some kind of composure because someone had to be the adult in this situation and Marissa was currently too busy falling apart. Emma, our daughter, was 14 and at that age where everything was already dramatic and world-ending, where a bad grade or a fight with a friend felt like the apocalypse. She'd walked into the kitchen with that teenage suspicion that something was wrong, probably picking up on the tension that was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it for breakfast. When we told her we were getting divorced, her face had crumpled like paper, and she'd started crying immediately, these huge gasping sobs that made her whole body shake. Why? She'd asked between sobs, and it was such a simple question with such a complicated answer. How do you explain to your 14-year-old daughter that her mother had been having an emotional affair, at minimum, with her billionaire boss? How do you tell her that sometimes love isn't enough, that people change, that marriages fail not with a bang, but with a series of small betrayals and lies that pile up until the whole structure collapses? You don't. You give her the sanitized version, the one that protects her from the uglier truths while still acknowledging that yes, this is really happening, and no, it's not her fault. Sometimes adults grow apart, I'd said, which was the diplomatic way of saying, your mother chose someone else and destroyed our family. Your mom and I both love you very much, and that's never going to change. But we've decided we can't be married anymore. It's not about you. This is between us. But Emma wasn't stupid. She'd seen the divorce papers on the counter where Marissa had left them after our fight. She'd probably heard us arguing the night before through her bedroom door despite our attempts to keep our voices down. Teenagers notice everything, especially the things you desperately want them not to notice. Her eyes had darted between me and Marissa, searching for more information, trying to piece together the real story from the carefully edited version we were feeding her. Is it because of Mom's boss? She'd asked, and my heart had stopped for a second because how did she know? Had she overheard something? Had she seen something? But before I could figure out how to respond to that landmine of a question, she'd continued. I heard you guys talking about him before, about how much time Mom spends with him. I'm not dumb, Dad. Marissa had made this strangled sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and I'd watched her try to formulate a response that wouldn't make her look like the bad guy in front of our daughter. But there was no good response. The truth made her look bad because the truth was bad. So she just sat there, tears streaming down her face, looking at Emma like she was watching something precious slip through her fingers. My son, Jake, was 12 and had always been the quiet one, the kid who processed things internally rather than exploding outward like his sister. He'd sat at the table completely silent while Emma cried, and we'd explained the situation. His face had been blank, neutral, giving away nothing, but I'd seen his hands clenched into fists under the table, knuckles white from the pressure. He hadn't cried, hadn't yelled, hadn't asked any questions. He'd just sat there like a statue, absorbing the information and doing whatever 12-year-old boys do when their entire world gets flipped upside down. When Emma had finally cried herself out and gone to her room, Jake had stayed at the table for another minute. He'd looked at Marissa, then at me, then back at Marissa. And then he'd shaken his head, just once, side to side, slow and deliberate. It was the kind of head shake that said everything without saying anything at all. Disappointment, disbelief, the death of innocence. Like he'd just found out Santa wasn't real, except worse, because at least when you find out about Santa, you're not also dealing with your parents' marriage imploding. He'd gotten up from the table without a word and walked out, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he'd gone up to his room. I'd heard his door close, not slam, just close, which somehow felt worse than if he'd slammed it. Slamming would have been emotion, would have been a reaction I could understand and work with. The quiet closing was resignation, acceptance, the sound of a kid who'd just learned that adults mess up too, and sometimes there's no fixing it. Marissa had looked at me across the table, her makeup-stained face a mess of regret and desperation. "Chris, they hate me," she'd whispered, and I'd wanted to tell her that of course they didn't hate her, that kids are resilient and they'd understand eventually. But I couldn't get the words out because part of me was thinking maybe they should be upset with her. Maybe that was the appropriate response to a parent who'd blown up their family for champagne dinners and expensive cologne. "They don't hate you," I'd finally said, because I'm not a complete monster and she was still their mother, regardless of what she'd done to our marriage. "They're hurt. They're confused. They're processing. Give them time." But even as I'd said it, I'd known that time wasn't going to magically fix this. You don't just bounce back from your parents divorcing. You don't just shake off the realization that the two people who created you couldn't figure out how to stay together. That kind of thing leaves a mark, creates trust issues, makes you wonder if love is even real or if it's just something people say until someone better comes along. Over the next few days, I'd watch my kids navigate their new reality with varying degrees of success. Emma had become clingy, constantly asking questions about where she'd live, whether she'd have to change schools, if we'd still do family dinners, if this meant we didn't love each other anymore. Each question was like a knife to the heart because they all stemmed from fear. Fear that her whole life was about to change, fear that she'd have to choose sides, fear that the divorce somehow reflected on her worth as a person. Jake had gone the opposite direction, retreating into himself like a turtle pulling into its shell. He'd become even quieter than usual, spending most of his time in his room playing video games or doing homework with his headphones on, creating a bubble of noise and distraction that kept the ugly reality at bay. When I tried to talk to him, tried to see if he was okay, he'd just given me one-word answers and these tight little smiles that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Dad," he'd say, but he wasn't fine. None of us were fine. We were all just pretending, going through the motions of normal life while everything burned down around us. Marissa had tried to talk to them multiple times, had attempted to explain herself in ways that wouldn't make her sound like the villain of this story. But how do you explain that to kids? How do you tell them, "I know I destroyed our family, but I had my reasons," without sounding like exactly the kind of person who would destroy their family? She'd bought Emma a new phone, as if technology could somehow compensate for traumatizing her. She'd taken Jake to his favorite restaurant, just the two of them, and apparently spent the whole meal crying while he'd eaten his burger in uncomfortable silence. The guilt was eating her alive, and part of me, the petty, hurt part, was glad. But the bigger part of me, the part that had loved her for 15 years and had created two beautiful kids with her, just felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that our children were collateral damage in a war they didn't start and couldn't stop. Sad that Emma's trust in romantic relationships was probably damaged before she'd even had her first real boyfriend. Sad that Jake had learned that the adults in his life could fail spectacularly and there was nothing he could do about it. Marissa had begged for another chance more times than I could count. She'd cornered me in the hallway after I'd put the kids to bed. She'd sent me long text messages at 2 in the morning. She'd left notes around the house like some kind of desperate scavenger hunt of regret. Each time, the message was the same. She'd made a mistake. She was sorry. She'd do anything to fix this. Please just give her one more chance. But every time she opened her mouth to beg, every time her lips started forming those practiced apologies and rehearsed promises, I heard something else entirely. I heard cash register sounds. Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. Because that's all Victor had seen her as, a pretty accessory he could afford until he got bored. A temporary distraction. Something shiny and new to play with until the novelty wore off, and he moved on to the next conquest. She was a commodity to him. A transaction. Probably not even the first employee he'd taken out to expensive dinners and wooed with attention and the promise of a lifestyle she couldn't afford on her own. And when she'd inevitably become inconvenient, when the affair got messy, or when someone found out, or when he just got tired of her, he'd discard her like last season's fashion. She'd lose her job, lose her marriage, lose her kids' respect. And for what? For some champagne and cologne and the temporary feeling of being special to someone rich? The math wasn't in her favor, and even she had to see that by now. Victor hadn't called her since the divorce papers were served, hadn't texted, hadn't shown up to save her or declare his love or do any of the things that happen in movies where the rich guy actually cares about the woman he's been seeing. He'd ghosted her completely, probably had his assistant block her number, had moved on to his next conquest before Marissa had even finished processing that she'd destroyed her marriage for someone who saw her as disposable. Every time she begged, I just saw her differently. Not as my wife, not as the woman I'd loved, but as someone who'd made a series of catastrophically bad decisions and was now facing the consequences. Someone who'd gambled our family on a fantasy and lost everything. Divorce day came with all the fanfare of a funeral, which I suppose was appropriate considering we were there to officially bury a marriage that had been dead for months. The courthouse was one of those government buildings that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought depression was an aesthetic choice. All gray concrete and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they'd been dead for 3 days. The hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams, and the benches outside the courtrooms were filled with people who all had that same 1,000-yard stare of individuals who'd learned the hard way that forever doesn't always mean forever. Marcus met me outside courtroom 3B, looking exactly like he always did. Rumpled suit, coffee-stained tie, leather briefcase that had seen better decades. But his eyes were sharp, focused, ready for battle. He'd gone over the paperwork with me 3 times already, made sure I understood every clause and stipulation, prepared me for questions the judge might ask. He was a good lawyer, but more than that, he was a good friend, and I could see in his face that he genuinely wanted me to walk out of here with my dignity and my financial future intact. "You ready for this?" he asked, gripping my shoulder in that way men do when they want to be supportive but don't quite know how to express emotions without making it weird. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, which was code for, "I'm terrified, but let's get this over with." We walked into the courtroom, and there she was. Marissa sat at the opposite table with her lawyer, some guy named Richard something or other, who looked like he charged by the syllable and probably had monogrammed cufflinks. She looked terrible, and I don't mean that in a petty way. I mean she genuinely looked like the last few months had taken a physical toll. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate styles she usually favored. She wore a conservative navy blue suit that screamed, "I'm taking this seriously, Your Honor, please believe me." No makeup, or at least not the dramatic makeup she usually wore. Dark circles under her eyes that no concealer could completely hide. She looked small and broken and nothing like the confident woman who'd walked out in that black dress what felt like a lifetime ago. Our eyes met for a second, and I saw something in her face. Regret. Maybe, or just exhaustion. Probably both. She'd lost weight, I noticed. Her suit hung a little loose on her frame, like she'd bought it when she was still eating regularly, and now it didn't quite fit right. Part of me felt bad for her. The other part remembered the cologne and the lies and the cold chicken, and that part won. Victor wasn't there, of course. Why would he be? Billionaires don't show up to courtrooms for other people's messy divorces. They're too busy counting their yachts or whatever it is billionaires do on a random Tuesday morning. He'd probably forgotten Marissa's name by now, moved on to some other employee with stars in her eyes and a marriage she was willing to sacrifice for his attention. Guys like Victor didn't face consequences. They just floated above the drama they created, untouchable and unbothered. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Morrison, and she had the expression of someone who'd seen literally everything human beings could do to each other and was no longer impressed or surprised by any of it. She looked at our case file like it was just another item on a very long list of people who'd made terrible decisions and now needed the state to help them sort out the wreckage. "This is a petition for dissolution of marriage between Christopher Kane and Marissa Kane," she said, her voice flat and businesslike. "I've reviewed the documentation submitted by both parties. Is there any possibility of reconciliation?" Marcus stood. "No, Your Honor. My client has made his decision and stands by it." Marissa's lawyer stood too. "Your Honor, my client would like to express that she believes there's still a chance for. Is there a possibility of reconciliation?" Judge Morrison repeated, looking directly at me this time, cutting through the lawyer's speak to get to the actual answer. I stood up. "No, Your Honor, there isn't." Marissa made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and I refused to look at her. Couldn't look at her. If I looked at her and saw tears, some stupid part of me might waver, might second guess, might fall back into the pattern of sacrificing my own well-being for hers. So I kept my eyes on the judge. "Very well," Judge Morrison said. "Let's proceed with the division of assets and custody arrangements." The next hour was a blur of legal terminology and financial discussions. Marissa's lawyer, Richard whatever his name was, tried to argue that she deserved half of everything, maybe more, because she'd contributed to the household and supported my client's career. Marcus had shut that down faster than a bouncer at a nightclub ejecting a drunk guy. "Your Honor," Marcus had said, and I could hear the barely contained amusement in his voice. "My client worked 3 jobs. He sold his personal vehicle to fund renovations to the marital home specifically at Mrs. Kane's request. He skipped vacations, worked overtime, and sacrificed his own well-being to provide for the family, while Mrs. Kane engaged in an inappropriate relationship with her employer. We have documentation of all financial contributions, and the numbers speak for themselves." Richard had sputtered, tried to object, but Judge Morrison had held up her hand. "I've seen the financial records, Counselor. Mr. Kane's contributions are well documented, unless you have evidence to the contrary." Richard had looked at Marissa, who'd shaken her head slightly, tears streaming down her face. She didn't have evidence because there wasn't any. She'd contributed to the household, sure, but not in the ways that mattered in divorce court. Not in the ways that showed up on paper and in bank statements. Then had come the truly ridiculous part. Richard, clearly desperate to get something for his client, had started listing off items Marissa wanted from the house. The kitchen appliances she'd insisted on, the furniture she'd picked out, the decorations that bore her aesthetic stamp. He'd gone on for a solid 5 minutes, reading from a list like he was at a particularly depressing auction. Marcus had let him finish, which I'd thought was generous, and then he'd leaned into his microphone. Judge Morrison had been taking notes, looking bored, probably thinking about her lunch break. And that's when I decided to contribute to the proceedings. I'd leaned forward into the microphone on our table, probably breaking some kind of courtroom protocol, and said, "Your Honor, she can have half the cold chicken still in my fridge." The courtroom had gone completely silent for about 3 seconds. Judge Morrison had looked up from her notes, her expression unreadable. Marcus had pressed his lips together, clearly trying not to laugh. Richard had looked confused, like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of legal maneuver he wasn't familiar with. And Marissa had just stared at me, her mouth slightly open. And then Judge Morrison had chuckled. Actually chuckled. It was quiet, barely audible, but it was definitely a laugh. Even the court reporter had smiled, her fingers pausing on her stenography machine for just a moment. "Mr. Kane," Judge Morrison had said, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice now, breaking through the professional monotone. "While I appreciate your sense of humor, let's stick to the assets listed in the documentation." "Yes, Your Honor," I'd said, sitting back, but I'd seen Marcus give me a subtle thumbs up under the table. Even he'd appreciated the moment of levity in what had otherwise been a depressing morning of watching a marriage get dissected like a frog in a high school biology class. The rest of the proceedings had gone smoothly, relatively speaking. The judge had divided assets fairly, giving me most of what I'd fought for because the documentation was clear and irrefutable. I'd get the house I'd worked myself into the ground to pay for. Marissa would get a reasonable settlement, enough to start over, but not enough to reward her for destroying our marriage. The kids would split time between us, though they'd made it clear they preferred staying with me most of the time, which had made Marissa cry harder. When it came time to sign the papers, the final official act that would transform us from married to divorced, from partners to strangers with shared children, Marissa's hand had shaken so badly she'd almost dropped the pen. I'd signed my name clearly, firmly, no hesitation. 15 years, reduced to a signature. Done. The marriage between Christopher Kane and Marissa Kane is hereby dissolved. Judge Morrison had declared, and just like that, it was over. Bang. Gavel down. Marriage dead. Move along. Next case, please. We'd walked out of that courtroom on opposite sides, literally and figuratively. Marissa had been flanked by her expensive lawyer who was probably already calculating his bill, her shoulders shaking with sobs, probably realizing she'd gambled everything and lost. I'd walked out with Marcus, who'd clapped me on the back and said, "You did good in there, brother." The chicken line was legendary. In the parking lot, I'd watched Marissa get into her car. She'd driven herself. No Victor waiting to comfort her. No knight in shining armor showing up to save her from the consequences of her actions. She'd sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine, and even from across the parking lot, I could see her crying. I'd felt a twinge of something. Not regret, exactly. Maybe sadness for what we'd had once, before it all went wrong. Sadness for the kids who'd have to grow up in a broken home. Sadness for the time wasted, the dreams that had died, the future we'd planned that would never happen. But mostly, I'd felt relief. Papers signed. Done. The end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever came next. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. Months later, the house felt different. Empty, sure, but not in a sad way. More like someone had finally cleared out all the clutter and you could actually see the floor again. Empty in the way a deep breath feels after you've been holding it for too long. The silence that used to suffocate me now felt like peace, like the universe had finally turned down the volume on all the noise and chaos and let me just exist without constantly being on guard. No more perfume lies lingering in the air, that expensive scent that used to announce Marissa's presence before she'd even entered the room. No more secretive texts lighting up her phone at odd hours, that telltale glow under the bedroom door at 2 in the morning. No more walking on eggshells wondering which version of my wife I'd encounter. The distant one, the irritated one, or the fake cheerful one that was somehow worse than both. Just me, my freedom, and my badly cooked chicken, which, by the way, tasted a hell of a lot better when you didn't season it with betrayal and lies. I'd started running again, something I'd given up years ago when working 3 jobs didn't leave time for luxuries like exercise or hobbies or basic self-care. Every morning at 6, before the kids woke up on the weeks they were with me, I'd lace up the running shoes I'd bought at a clearance sale and hit the neighborhood streets. My knees complained for the first few weeks, and my lungs felt like they'd forgotten how to process oxygen efficiently, but gradually it got easier. The pain became manageable, then barely noticeable, then gone entirely. Funny how that works. How something that hurts like hell at first becomes the thing that makes you feel alive again. I'd picked up guitar too, dusted off the acoustic that had been sitting in the closet since before Emma was born, collecting dust and broken dreams. My fingers fumbled at first, couldn't remember the chords I'd once known by heart, but YouTube tutorials and stubborn determination were slowly bringing it back. I wasn't good, not by any stretch, but I was getting better. And more importantly, I was doing something just for me, not because it would benefit someone else or make someone happy or contribute to some larger goal. Just because I wanted to. There was even a cooking class now, Tuesday nights at the community center, taught by this woman named Rita, who was probably 70 and had opinions about proper knife technique that she expressed loudly and frequently. She didn't lie about where she was going at night, mostly because she was always exactly where she said she'd be. In that community center kitchen, teaching people like me that garlic needs to be minced, not obliterated, and that pasta water should be salty like the sea, not like a swimming pool. The silence in the house no longer hurt. It healed. It gave me space to think, to breathe, to figure out who Chris was when he wasn't constantly trying to be enough for someone who'd already decided he wasn't. The silence let me hear my own thoughts without them being drowned out by anxiety and suspicion and the constant background noise of a failing marriage. Emma and Jake were adjusting, slowly but surely. They'd stopped asking if Mom and I might get back together, stopped looking at me with those heartbroken puppy eyes that made me want to fix everything even though I couldn't. Emma had even started bringing friends over again, their teenage laughter filling the house with a kind of noise I actually welcomed. Jake had joined the basketball team and talked more, slowly coming out of his shell, occasionally cracking jokes at dinner that reminded me he was still in there somewhere. Marissa had moved into an apartment across town, something modest that her salary could actually afford now that she wasn't supplementing her income with whatever Victor had been providing. I'd heard through Emma that Victor had fired her shortly after the divorce was finalized, some corporate restructuring excuse that everyone knew was really just him cutting loose an inconvenience. She'd found another job, something in marketing for a smaller company, making less money but probably learning an expensive lesson about mixing business with pleasure. If she wanted her rich boss so badly, she could have him. Except she couldn't, because he'd already moved on to his next conquest, his next shiny distraction, his next employee who didn't realize she was just another transaction. But that wasn't my problem anymore. Her choices, her consequences, her life to rebuild from the ashes of what she'd burned down. I got the better deal, peace, dignity, and the last laugh. The house was mine, the kids were happy, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. Not the exhausted, taken-for-granted version of myself that had emerged over 15 years of sacrificing everything. The actual me, the one who'd been buried under responsibility and disappointment and cold chicken. Freedom tasted better than I'd remembered. Better than champagne, better than expensive dinners, better than anything money could buy. It tasted like possibility, like second chances, like a life that was mine to live on my own terms. And yeah, sometimes that life included badly cooked chicken that was a little too dry or a little too bland. But it was my chicken, made in my kitchen, eaten at my table, without a side of lies. And honestly, that made it the best meal I'd had in years.